Okay, our guest speaker today is Larry Croll. I think most of you know him. He's been with us since 2004 as a docent. Out of high school, the U.S. Navy sent Larry to the Ohio State University for his undergraduate degree. Upon being commissioned in 1962, he entered flight training. Over the next 23 years, he was fortunate to fly 20-plus different aircraft. Like several other docents here, he's had several deployments and tours in support of operations in South Vietnam. This included flying C-1s out of Tan Son Nhut for a year. That has a famous approach named the Tan Son Nhut approach, which is basically aim for the ground to keep the ground fire from hitting you. Upon retirement from the Navy, he went to work for the military side of Boeing in Seattle. Larry worked on several aircraft programs, including the F-22, the Boeing Joint Strike Fighter, and the upgrade to the British Nimrod in the UK, which is their AEW aircraft. After retiring from Boeing, he and his wife returned to San Diego. He then worked for 3 years in Ryan on the Global Hawk UAV program while they had their retirement home built. Larry's been with us as a docent since 2004, and I'm now going to turn it over to him to talk about one of the most beautiful airplanes ever built, the Connie.
Thank you. I'm going to need to sit down to get up there.
Okay, Larry, so
We have
we have to be careful it's not blocking these up.
I was going to introduce myself, but
we know you just glorify yourself.
So Larry, you know how to do this real quick? Just the arrows?
I was going to use this.
You're probably best with the arrows. Just this button,
This is technology so much.
right here, just that button.
That goes forward.
Hey, here's your mic, Larry.
I'm going to try to do it without the mic, so everybody can hear me.
No.
They can't.
I hear you.
Mark, maybe give her the control, she can display for you while you hold the mic. You wanna do that, Linda?
I used 5 sources building the
Tell me
presentation.
what to do.
The internet has a tremendous amount of information, but you have to be very careful. One source, when you get into the details, one source will tell you the answer's 4 and the next will tell you it's 14. The two books I used, the first one is under the auspices of the Smithsonian, so it should be pretty good. The other one's in great detail and well footnoted. I used 2 of my Navy flight logs. My memory's the worst.
You use the microphone and I'll do the button for you.
Next
Ready?
next
Just tell me
slide.
when.
Next slide.
Got it.
To really understand this, I think you need to get a little aviation history in the U.S. By the late 20s, Boeing was much more than just a manufacturer. It had an airline. By September 29, it built the 80 3-engine biplane carrying 18 passengers. By 1930, under the title of United Aircraft and Transport Corporation, they were a monopoly. By then, they'd either merged or acquired Pacific Air Transport, Pratt & Whitney, Hamilton Aero Manufacturing Company, Chanspot, Sikorsky Manufacturing, Stearman Aircraft Corporation, Standard Metal Propeller Company, and National Air Transport. To me, that is a monopoly. Next slide. In 1933, the Boeing 247 was introduced, which set the standard. It is considered the first modern airliner. 10-passenger aircraft, all metal, low wing, much faster, safer, and easier to fly. It cut the time to go across the U.S. from 27 hours in trimotors to 20 hours. Number of stops from 14 to 6. Boeing built the first 60 of these for their umbrella company, United. They would not sell the aircraft to anyone else, which gave all the other airlines the back seat. Okay, next slide. That is a DC-1. 2 very major events happened at about the same time. The government passed the Airmail Act in 1934. This basically said, under the same corporate umbrella, you cannot have a manufacturer and an airline and get an airmail contract. To be profitable, the airline still needed the airmail contract. So this basically broke this monopoly up. Boeing went back to being Boeing. United became all the airlines. And Allied took over all the manufacturing companies. Because of Boeing's refusal to sell the airplane to the other airlines, TWA went to a small company in Santa Monica called Douglas. They convinced Don Douglas to build the DC-1, rapidly followed by the 2 and then the 3. The 3 was built because American went to Douglas and wanted an airplane slightly larger that they could replace their biplane sleepers with a DC. The DC-3s ruled. The number of DC-3s, C-47s, 117 produced varies, but it's approximately 10,650. I would expect there to be people in here that have flown C-47s or 117s. Okay, next slide. That's a DC-3. Next slide. And those are C-47s. The only way I can tell a 47 from a 117 is when the gear's down. The C-47 doesn't have a proper strut. It's got those pipes coming around the side. Okay, next slide. Okay, the shoe is truly on the other foot by this point, because there are estimates as high as 90% of the American airline travel was in DC-2s and 3s in the late 30s. Several airlines were trying to design a replacement for the DC-3, including Lockheed. Howard Hughes had set up Hughes Aircraft, established a new land speed record in 1935, 352 miles an hour, and had a record 91-hour flight around the world in 1938. In 39, he buys into TWA and sets up a gentleman by the name of Jack Fry as president. The two of them then go to Lockheed in secret. They do not go into the buildings. They meet in private homes, convincing Lockheed to build an airplane not to compete with or be slightly better, but to really leapfrog the available aircraft. The contracts are into Hughes Tool, and no TWA employee ever goes to Lockheed or contacts Lockheed. The proposed aircraft was to carry 57 passengers, crew of 6, cross-country in 8.5 hours, gross 68,000 pounds, be fully pressurized with a ceiling of 30,000 feet, and cruise at 300 miles an hour. That is not a DC-3, that is a jump. The engines were to be the yet fully developed Wright 3350s. It wasn't until the middle of 41 that little articles started to appear in like Aviation Week. So they managed to keep this secret for 2 years. Next slide. Okay, that's Hughes. There were delays. The first flight occurred in January of 43. The pilots, and the reason I have Eddie Allen underlined, he was considered the premier large aircraft test pilot. He was with Boeing. Lockheed contacted Boeing, got Allen, and then their chief pilot was the co-pilot. Now, Allen is dead a couple months later. He is flying the prototype of the B-29 with 3350s, and initially they were prone to engine fires. So he's trying to get a B-29 back into Boeing Field in Seattle. Engine fire, crashes, kills everybody. Okay. On 17 April in 44, in TWA colors, and this is Hughes in the cockpit, Hughes and Jack Fry set a new speed record between Burbank and DC. Average speed over 340 miles an hour. They cut 5 hours off the cross-country time. To me, that is tremendous. Next slide, please. Okay, that is C-69 transport in the TWA colors that was used for that. Now, what could have been? Okay, there are several events that were outside of Lockheed's control. If it hadn't gone that way, I believe that Lockheed and TWA would have controlled aviation for several years. What if World War II didn't happen when it did? What if the US government had more faith in the C-69 and had purchased more than 15 of them by the end of the war? Next slide, please. Okay, that's the 69 in government colors. During the war, the government wanted Lockheed to concentrate on the P-38 and the Hudson bombers they were building. They kept redirecting them on the 69, getting them to slow it down. And of course, I think this is superior to the 47, the 117, or the C-54. Next slide. That's a 54. People in this room with flight time in that? Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I'm not going to read that to you. You can read it yourself. I'm going to concentrate on the military side because that's where I know a little bit more about. At the end of the war, there were surplus airplanes all over the place. The Navy and the Air Force had their boneyards, Litchfield Park, and Davis-Monthan. There also doesn't appear to have been much U.S. government direction on where we should go. So people are at cross purposes. You need to compare that with the British Barbizon Committee. That strange name is the guy's name that headed the committee. In December of 42, when Britain could still lose the war, they set up a committee to figure out what direction and what type of aircraft the British government needed after the Second World War. We didn't do anything like that. Okay. It was only when I was putting together this presentation that I kind of understood why they had done that. It appears that there was an agreement between the US and the Brits that they would concentrate on bombers and we would provide them any transports they needed. So that's one of the reasons every time we see British transports, they're C-47s. If somebody in this group had thought about round windows instead of square windows, I think the de Havilland Comet would have led the world for several years because it's flying long before the Boeing 707 is. It's flying in the early 50s. And the reason I'm saying that is starting about 53 and 54, the first couple of comets crashed and they didn't know why. They built a water tank big enough to hold the fuselage and ran it through cycles of pressurization, depressurization. And they got fatigue cracks at the corners of the windows. That's the reason they went to round windows, but by then the public had lost their faith in them. Okay, next slide, please. The Super G. Once they got to the Super G, they had an aircraft that would carry over 100 people, cruise at 297 knots, range of 4620 nautical miles, with reserve. First Super G went to Northwest in 55. With the L-1649A, they had an aircraft with a range of over 6,100 miles, and it cruised at the same speed. That outclassed about everything else around there. If you remember, in the last couple of weeks, they've been talking about these long jet flights they're going to have of 20-some hours. This aircraft was flying from LAX to Heathrow nonstop, about 17 hours. While some of the early military connies are based on the 747, most were on the 1049 Super G. Approximately 332 were built. Okay, in the 50s and 60s, during the heights of the Cold War, The US Air Force and the US Navy use Connies in a lot of roles. So let's go over a couple of them. Next slide. As you would expect, transports and the Columbine was Eisenhower's aircraft. The Navy was also in MATS. They had 121 transports from 48. VR-7 and VR-8 operated out of Moffett Field with the Navy under MATS. And they were set up like Air Force squadrons. One flew, another one did the maintenance. Next slide. Okay, early warning. This is where most of the Navy Connies were used, is in the early warning. I believe this is also where the Navy term Willie Victor came from. The aircraft was a WV-2. When you're doing research, you have to be a little careful because the Navy changed its naming convention of aircraft in '62. So a WV-2 and an EC-121K are the same airplane. The Air Force also was involved in this effort, and so go to the next slide. A lot of people in this room remember the DEW line. In the 50s, Canada and the US were concerned that Russian bombers would come over the top. So they started building radar lines across Canada. There were 3 actually, but imagine the effort, time, and money to build the DEW line. It had 63 base radar sites in it. It went operational in '57, and it wasn't until 1988 that they disestablished it. Okay, they were then worried that the Russians could come around the sides. They used several different approaches to this. The one on the Atlantic side that looks like a oil rig platform was called a Texas Tower. The Navy had about 15 radar ships that patrolled in close on both coasts. The Air Force ran barriers in tight. The Navy used its barrier aircraft. There was one squadron based at Barbers. They flew out of Midway up to Adak and Kodiak in the Aleutians. They had several airplanes airborne all the time. On the Atlantic side, the Navy flew out of Argentia down to Lodges or Argentia over to Keflavik in Iceland. Again, several craft airborne all the time. That is a tremendous effort. Okay, show the next slide, please. That is the Navy Connie, and that is one of the radar picket ships. Next slide. You can see why they called it the Texas Towers. And look at the early helicopter on the pad. And that is not much of a pad to get in on, is it?
Especially in the wind.
Yep.
Riley, could you go back to that destroyer for a second?
Sure.
Back one. You look all the way back here, the way you can tell these guys immediately, they had an air search radar called the 30. That looked weird on these destroyers. They were being sent in this room.
Thank you. Okay, next. Okay, Navy had 2 reconnaissance squadrons flying EC-121Ms, VQ-1 in Atsugi, Japan, VQ-2 in Rota, Spain. They operated these from about 1960 till they were replaced by EP-3s in the early 70s. Their mission was to fuse real-time, comment, and SIGINT. They had a linguist on board as well as black box operators. Next slide. The Navy had 2 weather reconnaissance squadrons. VW-1 was the Pacific Squadron. It would be a disservice to just say that these guys look for typhoons. Initially, they were the 7th Fleet's EW. One of their detachments became VQ-1. And shortly, I'll tell you how these aircraft were involved in Vietnam. Next slide, please. VX-8 there are several other uses. This is the last one I'm gonna go over. They did oceans, graphic research during the summertime in the southern hemisphere. They flew out of Christchurch, New Zealand, down to Little America. And also they were involved in Vietnam. Next slide, please.
Little America, that's the Antarctic.
Yes. I should have asked this before, and when I was gonna introduce myself, I was gonna do that. Is there anybody in this room with time and Connie's? What function and,
It was a passenger plane. My family drove out to Iowa for Thanksgiving one year, and we were living in Washington at the time. We flew from Des Moines to Spokane.
okay.
Same thing.
Late 50s, maybe early 60s, around 1960.
Anybody that was in a crew in a Super Connie? The Air Force and the Navy used them a lot in Vietnam. AWACS, J-stars, spooks, and TV. Okay. The Air Force used them as the early AWACS. They flew out of Thailand, predominantly controlling the aircraft going into North Vietnam from the Laos side. Periodically, they did the same things in the Gulf of Tonkin side. Triple nickel is very famous. For years, it was outside at Dayton. Next slide. They now have it inside, which I think is great. So if anybody ever gets a chance, go up there. Next slide, please. After the Turner Joy and Maddox, is everybody up on that, or do I need to go over that for a minute? Okay. What?
I don't know. Oh, Gulf of Tonkin?
Yeah, in 1964, the Maddox, the U.S. destroyer, was operating independently in the Gulf of Tonkin. It's in international waters. It probably has one of those little EW vans on the back because it's trying to get information on North Vietnamese radar sites on the mainland and also on several of the islands. In the middle of the day, 3 North Vietnamese PT boats come out and attack it. What? Okay. They attack the Maddox. Maddox calls for air support. Carrier aircraft come out, attack the PT boats, set all 3 on fire, probably sink one of them. The Navy decides to send a second destroyer up there, the Turner Joy. Not that night, but the next night, the Turner Joy and the Maddox think they're under attack. A lot of people questioned that at the time. It didn't bother me either way. A lot of people have shot at ghosts in the dark. Years later, when he became famous, one of the pilots wrote a book, and he was flying that night, and he said there were no North Vietnamese PT boats. It turns out that McNamara and LBJ, within 48 hours, knew that there hadn't been an attack at night, and that's one of the lies they told the American people for years. It was one of their justifications to go into Vietnam. The reason I have the P3 up there is after this, the Navy is somewhat paranoid about North Vietnamese PT boats. So they use a weather Connie as an early J-stars, i.e. looks down at the surface, flying in the Gulf at night. They did this for several years, flying out of Sangley Point in the Philippines and then Cuby Point in the Philippines. Under them would be a Pouncer, an armed aircraft. A lot of the time it was P3s, initially flying out of Sangley and then later out of Cuby. And if the next slide, if they had an ASW carrier available, which wasn't very often, they would have an armed S2 flying under the Connie. Okay, next slide, please. VQ-1, in addition to its A3s on the carriers, had their spook aircraft flying over there, normally out of Da Nang, sometimes out of Thailand. Next slide. TV, VX-8, which we talked about earlier, had a couple of modified Super Connies, NC-121Js. They flew out of Tonsanut and Da Nang and provided Armed Forces radio and TV until ground stations were built. They also did a little PSYOPs for MACV. The ground stations for the TV and radio were built about 1970. Next slide, please. They told you that at first. In '63, there was a Cold War. There wasn't much of a shooting war. I was expected to go to Meridian and fly jets. There's the height of the Cold War. The Navy's talking about this new toy they're bringing out that I can go chase Russian submarines. So I decide that I want to fly P-3s. I had to explain to several senior people why I wanted to do that. The roadblocks were thrown, but I got around them. I ended up in the 1st West Coast P-3 Squadron, VP-9. I did not make the first deployment. I did make the second one, and I had some of the flights flying the armed P-3s out of Sangley into the Gulf of Tonkin at night. I'm real glad we never found a PT boat. PT boats were better armed than I was. Yes,
Were you
sir.
armed with depth charges or bombs?
We had a couple of pods of those Lao 19 pods, the 2.75s. Magnesium flares, those were all on wing stations. Bombay was full of depth charges. The last time I checked, you have to fly over your target with a depth charge. My second tour, next slide. VRF-32, another squadron across the bay here. You have honored the XO, that squadron, several times downstairs. That was Diz Lair. And to the best of my knowledge, he's almost your age. And he's still kicking, involved in tailboat. 32 and the sister squadron 31 were charged with moving the entire Navy inventory of aircraft around the world. Hence the logo, either King of the Road or King of Travel. Helicopters, props, jets. Strange squadron, no maintenance department, very large number of pilots. They had like 25 lieutenant commanders, a couple of commanders, then young officers deciding which direction they're going. I'm still the lieutenant. I'm one of the young officers. And then aircrew to fly it. The way they would work that is you would fly as a co-pilot with some of these people, hence my ability to get in a lot of different aircraft, till they decided whether you were useful or not. I flew as a co-pilot on a couple of Connies. These were by senior officers, commanders, lieutenant commanders, with a couple thousand hours in the aircraft. After a few flights, they decide that maybe the aircraft and I get along fairly well. So they send me off to VX-8, which is with a diminishing number of aircraft in the inventory. They provide the pilot and flight engineer training. VX-8 decides the same thing, that for some reason the aircraft and I get along together. They suggest that 32 accelerate my training. If they had have only known. About 6 weeks later, I'm an aircraft commander, and Super Connies, all of them, I have about 100 hours in type.
Wow.
Next slide, please. That is the cockpit,
Whoa.
a busy place. And
Lot of red handles.
a red hand. Now you'll notice that in the center, that's a modern nav aid. This one still flies, so they've replaced a couple of things. By American standards, you got the pilot on the left side, co-pilot on the right side, flight engineer behind the co-pilot. A very busy place. Next slide. Doing this, look carefully at the center instrument panel and the center console. This is a 4-engine transport. There are not many engine gauges or engine controls. You have to work with a flight engineer. Next slide. That gives you an idea what his station was like. Go ahead.
Were those the 3350s with the compound thrust?
Yes, had PRTs, power recovery turbines, round circular things on the outside of the engine of the cell. I want to say they said they got about 300 horsepower extra out of those.
Did you have any trouble with those engines, self-destructing, like I had heard the Connie had a propensity to do with their engines?
Like I said earlier, the 3350 had growing pains. You got fires. I never had one that threw anything.
What I heard was that the 3350s had problems because the engine came with a nacelle and didn't have enough airflow. What they did is they changed it and started putting the nacelle on the plane ahead of time, and with a lot of airflow, and then the 3350s were bolted into the nacelle. And once they started doing that, they had no further problems.
Yeah, because the third row was overheating. Next slide. I'm showing you this one. Again, it's the flight engineer station. You can see the little ball up there, and it looks like a carpenter's level up in the upper left on the panel. Okay, those of us that flew older airplanes were used to needle ball, which is just a little carpenter's level to keep the ball in the center so you're not side slipping. Why would you have one on the longitudinal axis of this aircraft?
Wing balance
Trim. There is a term called on the step. If you go on to the internet, there's some that'll say that's a myth. Now, some aircraft have very pronounced on the step. Lockheed obviously wouldn't have put that in there, and the crew use it if you didn't. The way you do that is at a cruise altitude, you don't want to go like this. You would think you want to go like this. Some of these aircraft, you actually fly above your cruise altitude, nose it over a little bit, come down to that altitude with a couple of degrees nose down. This thing, it felt right when it was on the step. And you got a little better performance because it didn't require quite as much power. Are there any questions? That's going to wrap it up. Yes, sir.
I flew the C-97 for one dreadful year, and
And you still have hearing?
What?
the C-130 was really quiet. As you rolled onto the runway as a pilot, as you start to push the power up, you'd say engineer throttles, and then he would control the throttles until you came over the overrun and landing, at which point he'd say throttle break off, then land your airplane. Is this one the same way? In other words, the engineer ran the throttles.
I'll tell you how bad the mission Connie was. With a full load of fuel, it had a negative rate of climb on 3 engines.
Yeah.
So your brief to the flight engineer included him dumping fuel for any emergency after refusal except a fire. You would tell him if you wanted him to dump fuel into the fire. Fortunately, I never had to make that decision. Okay. The flight manual allowed you several different ways. I would bring the throttles up. I would tell him what I wanted him to set. And normally I would have him set the power. Coming in, I would use him setting the power to almost flare. And then I would take over the throttles.
Same idea.
The P3, the rags teach them for the pilot to set all his power. Well, he's looking sideways at all those gauges. When he's in the cockpit setting power, when he should be looking outside. After you get a bunch of time in the P3, I started doing it like in the Connie. I used the engineer to do it until short final. And for me, that works.
And we would call it the power settings.
Yeah. Well, you
full pressure and RPM as you came into land. It was very confusing.
and you used we would just say the hundreds of manifold pressure we wanted, you know, say 2.7, 2.8, 2.6.
Larry,
So, two questions. You mentioned that the Super Connie had square windows.
No, that was the de Havilland comment.
No. Yeah, but you said initially, you said,
No, that was a comment.
no, I know the comment had square
Yeah,
windows.
that's what he said though.
Okay,
It
so,
had square windows.
so the Connie's never had square, okay. Thanks,
Yes,
Sure.
What was your second question?
I just wondered,
No,
what
it's related.
Okay.
was the advantage of the tri-tail?
I think there was so much, I'm not an aero type. I think there was so much power that they needed that much rudder, and they wanted to spread it out instead of having one huge one. The Air Force Connies, the center rudder actually didn't move. It was just an empennage.
Did you have any defense mechanism on the airplane?
No.
Just
No,
speed.
no chaff or anything? No. So if a missile came to you,
VQ-1 lost a Super Connie in international airspace off North Korea. The North Koreans shut it down.
Larry, got a question. You had one frame of what I believe was an RB-66. The spook
The Navy A3. Navy A3, yes.
in the Air Force, we had it at RB-66.
Yes, yes.
Same plane.
It is the same McDonnell airframe configured for different roles.
Yeah.
And the Air Force used the 66, somewhat similar that the Navy did.
Did they have a Hurricane Hunter Connie unit?
Yes,
Weather guys.
those were the weather Connies. VW1 and VW2. The Pacific one was based in Guam, VW1, and I can't tell you where the Atlantic Squadron was
I
based.
think Ross Rose, where we go.
Yeah, Roosevelt Roads. You can see them there all the time. I'd like to add something about the EC-121. My last command was OPTEP for Operational Test and Evaluation Force. And we used to all the time go to the missile ranges. And we set up the testing for a cruiser called Ticonderoga. And the idea was attack it with everything that they had available. They used the EC-121s both on that and Sea Sparrow program because they could do things with radio waves that I didn't think could be done. They were fantastic aircraft to use on range. But the guys in E3 said, there's a problem with that when we were at the briefing for the range. And they said, what? He said, we have to add the windshield wipers to the minimum equipment list. He said, why? He said, because all the oil blowing off those engines on 121.
Okay, thank you.
well done.